I set out for a hike alone, something I'd done countless times before, but this time it was different. I had planned this trip for weeks, choosing a remote trail I'd never been on before. It was late September, and the weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with that early autumn chill hanging in the air. The leaves were starting to turn, and the forest around me was alive with the color of changing foliage. I parked my car at the trailhead, took a deep breath, and began my trek. I had read the trail description online, and it sounded manageable, a moderate difficulty, a little over 6 miles in total. It would take me roughly 4 hours to complete, or so I thought. The trailhead was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize just how far out you are. There was no one else around, which suited me just fine. I liked being alone when I hiked. It gave me time to think, to clear my head, to just focus on the steps ahead of me. The first part of the hike was easy enough, wide paths, well-marked and not too steep. I passed by towering pine trees, their needles swaying slightly in the wind. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and damp in places, as if the forest itself was breathing in sync with me. The sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled light across the ground. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but as I moved deeper into the woods, the trail narrowed. The path became uneven, covered in loose rocks and roots that made it tricky to navigate. Still, I pressed on. There was something about being out in the wilderness, the challenge of the hike, that kept me going. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The sounds of the birds and insects gradually faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves or a snap of a twig underfoot. I checked my watch. About 2 hours in, I was making good time. The trail was still manageable, though the incline was getting steeper. The trees were starting to thin out a bit, and I could see glimpses of the sky through the branches above. I paused to drink some water, wiping the sweat from my brow. As I stood there, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being watched. It was a fleeting feeling, but it made my skin crawl. I shook it off, assuming it was just the solitude playing tricks on my mind. I continued on, the trail becoming more rugged as I neared the summit. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I was glad I'd brought a jacket. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the trail. My legs were starting to feel the strain of the climb, but I was close. I could see the faint outline of what appeared to be a rock outcropping ahead. I was nearly at the top. Then, just as I was about to reach the summit, I heard it, a low, growling sound. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't a normal sound. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it came from. I scanned the trees, the rocks, anything that could explain what I just heard. There was nothing. The growl came again, louder this time. It was definitely not the sound of any animal I recognized. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively backed away from the sound. My breath quickened, and I found myself listening harder, trying to make sense of it. Was it an animal? A bear? Maybe? I had read about bear sightings in the area, but I had never expected to come across one. I had all the proper gear, but that didn't mean I was ready for a confrontation. My mind raced through the things I knew. Stay calm, back away slowly, make yourself look bigger. But I didn't move, couldn't. My body was frozen, and all I could hear was that growl, echoing through the trees. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. It was the sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush. My pulse spiked. I didn't even think. I turned and ran. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder. My mind focused only on getting away. The trail was steep, and I was scrambling, slipping on loose rocks and tree roots. I didn't dare look back. I had no idea what was behind me, but the growls had stopped, replaced by the sounds of something crashing through the woods after me. The rush of adrenaline kept me moving, faster and faster, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified. My logical mind told me I should keep running, but I knew that if I didn't stop and figure out what was going on, I could end up lost or worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, I reached a clearing. The trail widened, and I saw a small stream ahead. I stumbled toward it, panting, and knelt beside the water, trying to steady myself. My mind raced. What was that thing? Why had it been growling at me? I forced myself to calm down, to focus on the present. I checked my phone. No signal. Typical. I took a few deep breaths, trying to gather my thoughts. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to think. I had to make a decision. I could either turn back, risk encountering whatever was out there again, or I could try to continue forward, toward the summit. But the summit didn't seem so important anymore. The growling, the sounds of something big following me. I knew I needed to get out of there. I opted to turn around and head back the way I came. My instincts told me it was the safer choice. I moved quickly but cautiously, scanning the forest around me as I went. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made my heart skip a beat. But there was nothing, no growl, no crashing sounds. I didn't stop to rest until I was back at the trailhead. My legs sore, my nerves frayed. The sun was lower in the sky now, the warmth of the day fading as the evening chill began to set in. I could see my car in the distance. The moment I got back to the parking lot, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I sat in the car for a long time, catching my breath, my mind still racing. I had been scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. Whatever had been following me was still out there, and I had no idea what it was. The hike had been supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it had turned into something else entirely. Something primal, something I couldn't explain. But I made it back, safe, and that was enough. It was a perfect morning for a hike. The sun had just risen, casting long shadows over the dense forest, and the air was still cool, with just a hint of dampness from the previous night's rain. I wasn't new to hiking, far from it. I had been on several solo hikes before, and I had learned to trust my instincts in the wilderness. But that morning, something felt different. Something unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I shrugged it off as nerves, probably just the fact that I was hiking alone in the remote parts of the Pine Ridge Trail. I was in my mid-30s, physically fit, and used to the routine of solo hikes. My pack was well prepared, my boots worn in but reliable, and my mind focused on the goal ahead. A 2-day hike to a secluded area where I could camp by the river. The trail was known to be peaceful and isolated, which was exactly what I was looking for. The town I lived in was small, and the woods felt like a refuge from the everyday. The Pine Ridge Trail wasn't easy to reach. Most people stuck to the main, well-maintained paths, but I'd found this stretch online after hours of researching obscure hiking spots. According to the map, I'd be venturing along a winding path that led into a narrow ravine. From there, it was a short hike to the river, where I could set up camp and just enjoy the solitude for a while. I had told no one exactly where I was going, just that I was hiking alone for a few days. It was something I did often, escape into the woods to clear my head. The town was always too noisy, too busy. Out there, in the stillness of nature, I could think without distraction. It was always easier to focus on the things that mattered when you were alone, without anyone else around to interrupt your thoughts. As I made my way down the narrow trail, the forest around me began to close in, the trees towering over me like silent giants. I could hear nothing but the crunch of gravel and fallen leaves beneath my boots, the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush, and the distant murmur of a creek flowing somewhere out of sight. I welcomed the quiet, and soon enough, my mind settled into the familiar rhythm of hiking. The deeper I went into the forest, the less I saw of other hikers. This stretch of the trail was far off the beaten path, and I hadn't passed anyone for hours. The only sign of human presence was the occasional faded trail marker, a small, painted symbol on a tree trunk, which told me I was still on course. It was when I reached a particularly narrow section of the path that I first began to feel it, the unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if something was watching me. I stopped for a moment, looking around, but saw nothing unusual. The forest was the same as it had been for the past few hours, calm and untouched. Still, the feeling remained. Shaking it off, I pushed forward, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. Hiking alone could do that to a person. But as the path wound tighter through the trees, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the sense of being watched only grew stronger. I quickened my pace, wanting to shake the feeling, but it followed me like a shadow, pressing down on me with every step. The sun had shifted higher in the sky by the time I came to a small clearing near the ravine. It wasn't much. A few scattered boulders, a patch of open ground, and a thin stream running through it, but it marked the point where the trail began to descend into the valley. The map I had showed that this was where I would start to veer off to the side, heading toward the river. But as I took a step into the clearing, something made me pause. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. It was so faint I almost didn't hear it, but there was no mistaking the sound of someone. Something moving in the woods. I turned slowly, scanning the dense underbrush, but there was nothing there. No one in sight. The clearing was empty. Maybe it was an animal. Deer maybe, or a rabbit. I wasn't exactly unfamiliar with forest wildlife, but this didn't feel like a deer. The sound had been too deliberate, almost too human. My instincts, honed over years of hiking, kicked in. Something about this felt off, but I couldn't figure out what. I shook my head and decided to move on. There was no point in standing around, paranoid and unsure. I needed to get to the river, set up camp, and forget about whatever weird sensation had crept over me. So I pushed forward, descending into the ravine, where the trail started to get steeper. The terrain was rougher here, the rocks more jagged, and the trees seemed to stretch higher and closer together, blocking out much of the sunlight. The temperature dropped slightly, and the air smelled rich with the scent of wet earth and moss. As I moved forward, my foot caught on a rock, and I stumbled, cursing under my breath. When I caught myself, I glanced around, suddenly aware that the forest had grown completely still. No more birds, no more rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet, the kind of silence that almost felt unnatural. I shook my head again, trying to push aside the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. I was being foolish. There was no reason to be scared, not out here in a place I knew so well. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pushing back against me, urging me to turn around. It was just then, as I rounded a corner in the path, that I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by one of the trees. But no, this was something more. Someone was standing just off the trail, almost hidden behind a thick cluster of bushes, staring straight at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. My mind had already been on edge, so maybe this was just a figment of my paranoia. But no, there was a person standing there watching me. I stood there, unmoving, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could it be another hiker? But no one else had passed me for hours, and this part of the trail was far off from any major routes. I should have seen them earlier. No, this person wasn't supposed to be here. I took a slow step back, my pulse racing. The figure didn't react, didn't even acknowledge my movement. They just stood there, perfectly still. I took another step back, and my foot slipped on a loose stone. The sound echoed in the quiet woods, and the figure finally moved, slowly, deliberately. I spun around and ran. No thought, no second guessing. I just ran, tearing through the thick underbrush, feeling the sharp branches claw at my arms and face. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the forest, trying to keep my balance. The trail was getting more difficult to follow as the terrain grew steeper, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The sound of footsteps followed me, steady and deliberate, though they were always a little behind. Just enough to let me know I wasn't imagining this. The figure was still there, following me, closing in. Panic surged in my chest, and I pushed myself harder, trying to outpace whoever or whatever was behind me. But the forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in closer as if they were trying to trap me. I couldn't hear anything except my own frantic breathing and the pounding of my heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto the riverbank. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. I stopped to catch my breath, looking around frantically. The forest was still quiet, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then I saw it, a flash of movement across the river. The figure, standing on the opposite bank, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran along the river, hoping to find some way out of this nightmare. But the path was narrow, and the forest was still thick around me. I didn't know how much further I could go before exhaustion set in. But somehow, in the distance, I saw a sign of civilization. A small clearing with a trail marker, one that led back to the main path. I ran towards it, my heart racing in my chest, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the main trail. I wasn't sure how long I had been running, but it felt like hours. My breath was ragged, my legs shaking with exhaustion. As I emerged from the woods and saw the parking lot in the distance, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The figure was gone, but I knew it hadn't been a hallucination. I had seen them, and whatever it was, it hadn't left. It had been following me, and maybe, just maybe, it still was. But I was out of the woods, for now, and that was enough. I had been hiking alone for the past 2 days, just outside of Crater Lake National Park, in Oregon. The weather had been unpredictable, with bursts of sunshine followed by heavy showers. It was late fall, just before the cold of winter fully settled in. I wasn't particularly new to hiking. In fact, I had spent a significant amount of time outdoors, but this trip was different. I'd chosen this route to push myself and test my limits. I had done some research, but deep down, I knew this was going to be a challenge. I'm 29 years old, tall, with a lean build from spending most of my time in the gym or outdoors. My brown hair was a bit longer than usual, tucked behind my ears under the hood of my jacket. I wore a faded green backpack that I had for years, and I'd packed it carefully, making sure to bring everything I thought I'd need. I wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks, but as I walked through the forest, I felt the pulse of excitement and a sense of serenity. The first day was fairly uneventful. I hiked a total of about 12 miles through the dense forest, occasionally crossing small streams and noticing the signs of wildlife. The trees were a mix of tall pines and deciduous trees, their leaves turning orange and yellow with the changing season. As evening approached, I set up camp near a small clearing, the soft sound of a distant waterfall filling the air. I had chosen a spot close to a trail, not wanting to get too far off the beaten path. After a quick dinner, I crawled into my tent, zipping it tight and settling in for the night. The wind outside was picking up, making the trees sway, and I could hear the occasional snap of a branch breaking. I didn't mind. It was soothing. What bothered me, though, was a subtle sense of being watched. I knew it was probably just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling lingered. My eyes fluttered shut, and I eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, I woke up early, packed my things, and set off again. My plan was to cover another 10 to 12 miles. The sun had risen, casting long shadows over the forest floor. As I walked, I couldn't shake the strange feeling from the night before, but I tried to focus on the trail, pushing the thought aside. The forest was still and quiet, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots against the damp ground and the occasional rustling of leaves. By mid-morning, I reached a narrow ridge that offered an incredible view of the valley below. I stopped for a break, pulling out a granola bar and taking a swig of water. The air was crisp, and the sky had cleared up, revealing a perfect blue. As I stood there, taking in the scenery, I couldn't help but feel a bit of pride in what I was accomplishing. I had been pushing myself harder than I ever had before, and I felt strong, even with the previous day's exertions. I sat on a rock near the edge of the ridge and looked down. There was a small creek below that meandered through the valley, the water sparkling in the sunlight. The only other sounds I could hear were birds calling in the distance and the faint rustling of leaves in the trees. The peace of the place was almost overwhelming. It was beautiful, and yet, something felt a little off. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the quiet had a weight to it. My instincts, usually sharp, were telling me something was wrong. I brushed the thought away, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks again. I continued on, my pace steady, The trail had become more rugged, and the forest denser. I was now on a trail that wasn't as well marked, a part of the wilderness that didn't see much foot traffic. I found myself wondering if I had made the right choice in continuing along this path. The forest around me seemed to close in more with every step, the trees growing taller and thicker, the ground uneven, making my progress slower. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that I hadn't seen any other hikers since I had left the ridge earlier. The silence had become deeper, almost suffocating. It was strange for such a busy park to be this empty, but there was no sign of anyone. The feeling of unease from the previous day returned in full force, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the sense of being watched now. It was the feeling that something or someone was nearby, hidden just out of sight. I quickened my pace, not wanting to dwell on the thought, but it only made the forest feel more oppressive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone, or something, was there. The air grew heavier, and the rustling of the leaves seemed more frantic, almost as if the trees were warning me about something. My heart was starting to race, but I pushed through the anxiety, telling myself it was all in my head. The trail eventually led me to a small, narrow canyon. I stopped for a moment to take in the view. The walls of the canyon rose steeply on either side, the rock face dotted with patches of moss and lichen. There was a thin stream running along the bottom of the canyon, its water sparkling under the weak sunlight. I decided to rest here for a bit. I pulled out my map and checked my position, trying to get a sense of where I was and how far I had to go to the next campsite. As I sat there, catching my breath and taking a drink of water, I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound didn't quite match. It was a low rustling, coming from the bushes a little ways off. It was too deliberate to be the wind. My heart skipped a beat. My eyes darted around, scanning the canyon walls, the trees, anything that could give me a sign of what was making the noise. Then I heard it again, a rustling, followed by a low grunt. The sound was too deep and heavy to be an animal like a deer or a raccoon. My first thought was a bear, but that didn't make sense. Bears weren't usually active this late in the season, and they typically avoided human contact. I stood up slowly, my body tense. I hadn't seen any signs of bear activity along the trail, but the noise was unmistakable. I began to back away quietly, trying not to make a sound. My eyes were fixed on the bushes where I had heard the noise, but there was no movement. I strained my ears, listening for anything that would give me a clue as to what was out there. Suddenly, there was a loud crack of a branch breaking. That was enough. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding my system. I turned and sprinted, my boots slamming against the uneven ground as I dashed back toward the ridge, my breathing shallow and fast. The sound of the rustling followed me, but I dared not look back. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't about to wait around and find out. I ran for what felt like miles, my legs burning, my chest tight from the exertion. The forest seemed to blur around me as I pushed myself harder, driven by fear. Every time I thought I heard something behind me, my pace quickened. The trail was becoming steeper, and the trees more densely packed. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this panicked. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I reached the ridge where I had stopped earlier in the day. I wasn't sure if I was safe yet, but at least I felt like I had a clear vantage point. I stopped to catch my breath, my back pressed against a large boulder. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the light was fading fast. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I stayed there for a while, listening. The forest was still. There was no sign of whatever had been following me. I knew I couldn't stay on the ridge all night. It was too exposed, and it was getting colder. I had to make a decision: continue on the trail or turn back. I didn't like the idea of turning back, but I wasn't sure if I could trust my instincts anymore. I decided to press on. I took a deep breath and made my way down the ridge, my pace slow and deliberate. The feeling of being watched had not left me, but there was a sense of relief in knowing I was on a clear path again. As the evening crept in, I found a place to camp, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding area. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. By morning, I packed up quickly and made my way back to the main trailhead. When I finally emerged from the woods and saw the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. I didn't know exactly what had happened out there, but I was glad to be done. The trip had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd come out stronger, but I also knew that the wilderness had a way of making you feel small and vulnerable. The rest of the hike went smoothly, but I would never forget the feeling of being watched, the fear of something lurking in the woods. I couldn't help but think, maybe some parts of the wilderness are meant to be left alone. It was late autumn when I decided to go for a hike in the mountains. I had been wanting to escape the noise of the city for weeks, and the crisp, fresh air of the forest seemed like the perfect remedy. I was in my early 30s, not a professional hiker, but not a complete novice either. I'd done a fair share of short hikes before, always in familiar spots where the trails were well marked, and I knew I'd be safe. This time, though, I wanted something different, something remote. So, I picked a mountain range a few hours outside of town, one that wasn't as well known. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It felt good to get away, to be on my own. I left early that morning, the sky just starting to lighten as I drove along the winding mountain road. The trees were starting to shed their leaves, leaving the forest floor scattered with golden and red foliage. It was beautiful, and I felt a deep sense of peace as I drove deeper into the wilderness. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was still quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I checked my gear, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, my map, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. The hike wasn't supposed to be a tough one. The trail was listed as moderate, maybe 7 or 8 miles, with an elevation gain of around 2,500 feet. I'd done harder hikes before, so this seemed manageable. I took the first few steps with an easy confidence, breathing in the cool, fresh air. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me, and the trail was narrow but clear. There was something calming about the way the light filtered through the canopy, casting shadows that danced on the ground. I didn't rush, just moved at my own pace, feeling the soft ground beneath me and listening to the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. A couple of hours in, the trail started to get steeper. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I didn't mind. It was a good kind of burn. I took a break, sitting down on a large rock to catch my breath and take a drink of water. I checked my map, confirming that I was on the right path. According to the map, there was a small ridge about a mile ahead where I could stop and take in the view. That was my goal. As I continued on, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. It wasn't the usual quiet of the wilderness, where you could hear the occasional bird or the wind rustling through the leaves. No, this was an unnerving silence, like the forest had decided to hold its breath. Even the usual forest sounds, the chirping of insects, the calls of distant animals were gone. I pushed the thought aside. It was just my imagination. After all, the wilderness had its moods, and this was a peaceful, isolated place. I didn't think anything of it, but then I heard something, a snap of a twig just off the trail. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made me stop. I froze and listened carefully. The silence returned, but now it felt thicker, more oppressive. I glanced around, but saw nothing. No movement in the trees, no shape through the thick underbrush. Could have been a deer or a squirrel, I told myself. Probably just a trick of the wind. Still, the hair on the back of my neck prickled. I quickly shook the feeling off and pressed on. The next mile seemed to drag on longer than it should have. The trail wound upward, and the air grew colder. I began to notice more signs of disturbance around me. Branches that had been broken, leaves scattered in odd patterns. It was as if something had been moving through the forest, something heavier than a deer or a bear. I began to scan the area around me more carefully, looking for any signs of wildlife or, more unsettling, any signs of human activity. That was when I saw it. A small clearing up ahead, just off the trail. The light was dim, but I could make out something strange in the center of the clearing. A pile of rocks. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, but as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just a random pile of rocks. It was too neatly arranged, as if someone had carefully stacked them. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the rocks. It was the sense of something deliberate, something purposeful. A feeling that the place wasn't as untouched as I had thought. I hesitated, my mind racing. This wasn't a trail marker. There weren't any signs of human activity in this area, and no one else was supposed to be out here today. I knew that for sure. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, telling me to turn around, to leave. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, my footfalls quiet against the forest floor. The clearing was small, maybe 10 feet across, and the rocks were arranged in a rough circle. But what caught my attention wasn't the rocks. It was the ground in the center. The dirt had been disturbed, as though someone had recently dug at the earth. There was a strange, shallow depression in the middle, and a few odd marks around the edges. It didn't look like animal tracks. It didn't look like anything I had seen before. I stepped back, my heart racing. Could have been nothing. Could have been something as simple as a deer scraping the ground, or maybe someone else had passed through before me and left their mark. But something told me that wasn't the case. The whole scene felt wrong. Suddenly, there was that snap of a twig again, only this time it was closer. Too close. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The air seemed to tighten, the stillness pressing in on me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I looked into the trees, trying to see if anyone was watching. I didn't see anything. No movement, no signs of life. But something was there, I was sure of it. I didn't know why, but I turned and started walking faster. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly before me, my pace quickening, my breath coming faster as I pushed myself forward. I glanced over my shoulder once, just once, but there was nothing there, just the dense forest. But the unease didn't leave me. If anything, it deepened. The silence around me felt wrong now, like I wasn't alone. Every step seemed to echo louder in my ears. Every rustle of leaves felt too sharp, too deliberate. It was as if something or someone was following me. By the time I reached the ridge, I was exhausted. I had pushed myself hard, faster than I should have, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The view from the ridge was spectacular, but it didn't bring me any peace. I couldn't shake the thoughts racing through my mind, the images of the clearing, the strange rocks, and the eerie silence that still clung to the forest. I sat there for a while, trying to calm myself, taking deep breaths and reminding myself that I was overreacting. There was nothing out there. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. After about 20 minutes, I stood up and made the decision to head back. The last thing I wanted was to stay out here longer than I needed to, especially with the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. As I turned to head back down the trail, the forest around me seemed to settle, the tension lifting, and I allowed myself to relax, telling myself it had all been in my head. But when I reached the spot where the clearing had been, my heart skipped a beat. The rocks were gone. There was no sign of them, no trace of the strange circle I had seen before. It was as if it had never existed. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, and I quickened my pace. I didn't stop until I was back at the trailhead. And when I reached my car, I didn't look back at the woods. Couldn't. I didn't know what I had seen out there, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that it felt wrong. Too wrong to be just a coincidence. As I drove back to the city, the landscape behind me seemed to close in, the trees stretching up like silent sentinels, watching. I didn't know if I would ever go back to those mountains. Part of me wanted to forget about it, to chalk it up to my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. Whatever I had experienced out there, it was real, and I would never forget it. I had been hiking for hours when the day began to turn dark. The sun had been low in the sky for a while now, casting long shadows over the dense forest around me. I had no intention of stopping anytime soon. After all, I had the whole weekend planned for this hike, and I wanted to take full advantage of the time. It was early autumn, and the chill in the air was starting to feel like it might settle in for the evening. I wasn't exactly an experienced hiker, but I was in decent shape. I was 29 years old, and this was the first time I'd taken a solo trip in the wilderness. I needed a break from city life, a break from the noise and chaos. My phone had no service out here, and I found that oddly comforting. No calls, no messages, just me and the mountains. I had chosen this trail because it wasn't too popular, and I thought I could avoid the crowds that I'd seen on some of the other trails nearby. The trail was part of a smaller park near a remote area of the Rockies. The name of the trail was simple, the Lost Ridge Trail. It was said to be a moderately difficult trail, and while the scenery was supposed to be beautiful, it was also known for being a little off the beaten path. That appealed to me because I didn't want to be surrounded by a bunch of other hikers. I craved solitude, and this trail seemed like the perfect fit. The first few miles were easy enough. I crossed over several small streams, and the trail wound its way through thick woods, the ground soft with fallen pine needles. The air smelled like damp earth and wood, a comforting, grounding scent that made me feel more connected to nature. There were occasional breaks in the trees, where I could see the distant peaks of the mountains ahead. But as the hours passed, the trail began to get steeper and the woods thicker. By the time I reached the halfway point, I had already eaten my lunch, a protein bar and some fruit, and I felt energized. But something was starting to feel off. It wasn't the trail itself, it was too quiet. No birds chirped, no wind rustled through the trees. I didn't hear any of the usual forest sounds that I had expected. There were no animals, no insects. It was as though the whole forest had fallen silent, and I was the only thing moving in it. First, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the time of day, or maybe it was because I was so far from any towns or people. But the more I walked, the more unsettled I became. It was almost as if something was watching me, like a presence that wasn't immediately obvious but still there, lurking. I brushed it off again, telling myself it was nothing. I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. But as the trail twisted and turned, it seemed to get harder to follow. The markers on the trees were sparse, and there were more places where the trail split off in multiple directions. I had a map, but it wasn't helping much. It was as if the trail had been intentionally poorly maintained. The further I went, the more I felt like I was walking into unknown territory. I had been hiking for several hours when I reached a small clearing. The sky was now overcast, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I decided to take a break and check my supplies. I still had plenty of water, and the weather didn't seem like it would turn too bad, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was no reason to feel like that. Nothing had happened. No odd sounds or signs, just this strange sense of being observed. I sat on a log, unzipped my pack, and pulled out my map. My hands were shaking a little, and I couldn't figure out why. Something didn't feel right, and I felt the sudden urgency to keep moving, to get off the trail and back to the main area where it would be safer. But that feeling of being watched was still gnawing at me. I stood up, ready to head back, but that's when I heard it. A crack, the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping. I froze. It wasn't a wind-blown branch, no, it was something heavy, something large. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around quickly, trying to pinpoint where the sound came from. It was too far to see, too distant, but the echo had come from behind me, down the trail. I couldn't see anything, just the dense trees and the path snaking further into the woods. I thought about calling out, but I didn't. The quiet had returned, and there was a sudden dread in my gut that made me feel like I had to keep moving, like I had to leave right now. I grabbed my things, threw my pack over my shoulder, and began walking faster, almost jogging at times, but always keeping my eyes peeled, my ears alert. The further I went, the worse the feeling grew. There was something wrong with the air, like it was too thick, too heavy to breathe properly. The silence was so intense that every sound felt like a drumbeat, echoing in my head. I kept walking, the trail now steeper and more rugged. My pace quickened, my legs burning, but I didn't stop. I didn't know what I was running from, but I felt a primal fear deep inside, something that told me to get out of this place as quickly as possible. Then I heard it again. This time it was much closer. The sound of something moving through the brush, snapping twigs as it moved, just off to the side of the trail. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't stop to look. Couldn't stop. My legs were shaking as I moved faster than I had ever gone in my life. I knew whatever it was gaining on me. Suddenly, I heard a rustle right behind me. Without thinking, I spun around, expecting to see some wild animal. A bear? Maybe, or a mountain lion. But when I turned, there was nothing. No animal, no person. Just the darkening trees and the fading light of the sun. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like the air had thickened even more, like something was hovering over me, watching my every move. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I had to keep moving, I thought. There was no choice now. The trail ahead started to descend into a rocky gorge, and the trees began to thin out. I looked around frantically, trying to get my bearings. The landscape was unfamiliar. There was no sign of the markers anymore. The trail had become a maze of rocks and uneven terrain. Felt wrong. All of it felt wrong. Just then, I saw movement at the corner of my eye. I whipped around again, but again, nothing. No animal, no person. I stood still, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. The chill in the air grew colder. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and began running, sprinting, down the steep path, barely watching where I was going. My foot slipped, and I tumbled down the rocky slope, my knees scraping against the jagged rocks as I struggled to regain my balance. I didn't care. I had to get away. At the bottom of the gorge, I finally stopped, panting and exhausted. My knees were scraped and bleeding, and my palms were raw from where I'd fallen. But I didn't care about that. All I could think about was getting out of there. The light was almost gone now, and the sky had darkened completely. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the sounds of my own breath, heavy and fast, mixing with the distant rustle of the trees. But there was something else now, too. A faint sound, like footsteps crunching the leaves. I started walking again, my legs shaking, my thoughts scattered. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. Whatever it was still following me. I could feel it in my bones. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I came to the edge of the forest. The trees parted, and I saw the outline of the parking lot in the distance. I had made it back to the trailhead. I stumbled forward, breathless, my heart still racing. I had made it. I didn't stop to look back. The forest had been silent again, and I didn't need to hear another sound. I knew I was far enough away. Whatever had been following me, whatever had been lurking in the trees, was no longer a threat. I was safe. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't drive off immediately. I sat there for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart still hammering in my chest. What had I experienced? What had been following me through those woods? I didn't know, but I didn't care anymore. All I cared about was that I was out of there, and I knew, deep down, that I'd never set foot on that trail again. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon as I finished lacing up my boots. The trail stretched out ahead of me, narrow and winding through thick patches of pine and birch trees. I had been planning this solo hike for months. I had heard that the area around U Mountain had some of the most breathtaking views, so I figured it would be the perfect way to clear my head. The timing wasn't great, with nightfall creeping in faster than expected, but I'd done this before, hiking in the twilight hours, using my headlamp to guide the way. It was just another adventure. I had always loved hiking, especially in places where few others ventured. There was something about the isolation that gave me a sense of peace, a rare kind of stillness that you can't find in the city or on a crowded trail. That day, I was out on my own, taking on a portion of the trail that I'd never hiked before. My pack was light, just water, a few snacks, my map, and a thermal blanket. Nothing too fancy. I had a good idea of the trail, and though it was a longer one, I felt confident that I could make it to the peak before nightfall. I had underestimated how quickly the day would turn. By the time I reached the halfway point, the light was fading much faster than I had expected. The shadows of the trees lengthened, stretching out like fingers across the rocky trail. The air felt cooler, and I adjusted the collar of my jacket, realizing it was colder than I'd thought for late summer. The trail was narrow, and the trees closed in around me, their branches thick with leaves that rustled as the wind picked up. The forest felt alive, but eerily so, with the sound of animals shifting through the underbrush just out of sight. I didn't like the feeling. It was one of those moments when you sense something isn't right but can't quite put your finger on it. I'd hiked hundreds of miles on my own, but this time something felt off. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the isolation of the area or the tiredness starting to set in. The deeper I got, the quieter it became. The sound of birds and insects faded. Only the sound of my boots on the dirt and the rustle of wind through the trees filled the air. A sudden chill swept over me, and I stopped to pull my jacket tighter. Something wasn't right. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing unusual. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks after being on the trail for so long. I checked my map again, though I was certain I was still on track. The trail began to climb a little more steeply, and the rocks underfoot became loose. I was careful with my footing as the path narrowed even further. The trees on either side felt like walls, their trunks so close together that it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. The sun was almost gone now, and the forest had grown dark, save for the pale glow of my headlamp. As I continued up the trail, a strange sensation crept up my spine, the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. I stopped and glanced behind me, but the trail was empty. There was nothing but the quiet rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs. I told myself to relax, to focus on the trail ahead. But my senses were heightened, more alert than usual, as if something or someone was lurking just out of sight. I pressed on. Then I heard it, a low, guttural noise from somewhere behind me. Not an animal, but something that didn't sound natural. The sound was brief, followed by complete silence. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen, listening intently. Nothing. Not a rustle in the trees, not a single sound of wildlife, just silence. I turned around quickly, my headlamp illuminating the trail behind me, but there was no one there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew it was likely just an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger. Still, my instincts told me to pick up the pace. I glanced at the map again, trying to reassure myself that I was nearly at the peak. If I could just make it there, I would feel safer. But the closer I got, the stranger the atmosphere felt. The wind picked up again, shaking the leaves in an unnerving way, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had never felt so exposed before. The trees were so close now that they almost seemed to trap me in, their branches overhead blocking out what little light the moon provided. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. A rustling in the trees, followed by that same low, almost growling noise. I froze, the hairs on my arms standing on end. This wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a coyote. It was too deliberate, too calculated. I stood motionless, listening as the sound grew closer. The noise was unmistakable now. Footsteps, heavy ones. My breath quickened, my thoughts racing. Was I being followed? I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, and the idea of someone else being out here at this hour, with no other hikers in sight, made my stomach churn. I slowly turned around, my headlamp casting a beam of light behind me. The trail was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the edge of the light, lurking in the shadows. I took a few steps forward, my footsteps slow and cautious, and that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush, heading straight for me. I started to walk faster, my pulse hammering in my chest. The trail felt even more confining now, and the walls of trees seemed to press in on me. I had to get out of there. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct told me that something was terribly wrong. I heard the steps again, louder this time, moving in the same direction I was walking. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone or something was following me. I broke into a jog, pushing myself harder, my legs aching with every step. The darkness around me seemed to grow thicker, the shadows swallowing the light from my headlamp. I was almost running now, my breath ragged as I tried to make my way up the trail. But every time I picked up my pace, I heard the footsteps behind me, keeping perfect rhythm with mine. There was no way it was just my imagination. My mind raced as I thought through my options. There was no phone service here, no way to call for help. The nearest ranger station was miles away. My only hope was to reach the peak, where there was supposed to be a lookout cabin. I wasn't sure how much further it was, but I had to make it. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I heard a distinct crunch, like something heavy stepping on a branch. My heart slammed in my chest as I whipped around. There, in the distance, just outside the light of my headlamp, I saw a figure standing among the trees. A man. He was tall, cloaked in darkness, standing perfectly still. His face was hidden, but I could see the outline of him, the way he was watching me, unmoving. My blood turned cold. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He simply watched. I didn't wait to find out who he was or what he wanted. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose rocks, my headlamp swinging wildly in front of me. The figure remained still, but I knew he was watching. I could feel it in my bones. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burn in my legs. The darkness seemed to close in, the trees leaning in like spectators at some twisted race. I didn't dare look back, knowing the figure was still behind me. I finally reached the peak, breathless, my legs shaking from the adrenaline and fear. I could see the outline of the cabin in the distance, its silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, not daring to slow down until I was inside. The door creaked open as I shoved it, locking it behind me once I was inside. I leaned against it, my breath ragged, eyes darting around the small, dimly lit room. There was no sign of anyone following me. I stayed there the entire night, awake and on edge, too terrified to sleep. The figure outside never approached the cabin. And when the sun finally rose, I packed up and left as quickly as I could, not stopping to look behind me. I didn't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I descended from the mountain, I realized how lucky I had been to get out of there alive. The feeling of being watched never truly left me until I made it back to the safety of civilization. And even now, whenever I think back on that night, I can still feel the cold chill of fear that gripped me when I saw that figure standing just outside my light. It was the Christmas of 1998, and I was about 8 years old when my family, along with a few close friends, went camping in the remote bushlands just outside a small town in the Northern Territory of Australia. We weren't camping in a typical campground. No designated spots or picnic tables. This was a real wilderness experience. The trees towered above us, thick and full of life, and the ground was covered with fallen leaves and the occasional sharp rock. The days were hot, but the nights were cool, and the stars above us seemed so close. They felt like they could reach out and touch you if you stood still enough. There were 10 of us kids in total, ranging from 8 years old to about 15, all with a sense of freedom as our parents set up camp. We were allowed to roam as long as we stayed within earshot of the campsite, which was easy enough, considering the terrain wasn't as flat and wide as we were used to back home. The landscape here had a sense of quiet isolation. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus, and the hum of insects was constant, filling the background like a low, buzzing soundtrack. At that age, the bush seemed like a vast playground. Every tree, every rock, every shadow felt like an opportunity for adventure. Our parents had brought along a few walkie-talkies, each child receiving one. They weren't used much, but it was a safety measure. When the sun was high, the day dragged on, and we spent our time exploring the thick vegetation. We would often wander through narrow tracks or climb on the jagged boulders by the creek that ran a few hundred yards from camp. There was a small waterfall too, and we loved sitting by it, watching the water rush past, all of us pretending to be explorers in some uncharted land. The days were carefree, filled with shouts of excitement and laughter as we ran through the brush. But one afternoon, everything changed. It was just after lunch when I had wandered off with my best friend, Tom. We had been walking along a trail we hadn't noticed before, a narrow path between the trees that led further into the bush. We weren't lost, per se, just a bit farther from camp than usual. We had made a habit of keeping track of time and direction, but we weren't paying much attention that day. It was when we were walking past a large, gnarled tree that the static crackled in on the walkie-talkie I had tucked into my pocket. Tom and I stopped, looking at each other in confusion. It wasn't unusual for the devices to pick up random interference, but this time it sounded like a voice, faint but clear enough to make us freeze. "Ho ho ho, is this the right spot? I'm trying to find you all to bring the presents," the voice said, slow and deliberate. We stared at the walkie-talkie, eyes wide, confused, and a little excited. Santa? But we thought Santa didn't come out this early, and besides, who else would have access to a walkie-talkie out here in the middle of nowhere? I didn't even hear our parents talking, which made the voice feel even stranger. The man's voice came through again, a little clearer this time, but still with that odd, unfamiliar tone. "Can you hear me? I'm looking for you, kids. Can you come find me?" Tom and I looked at each other, bewildered. Was it a prank? Who else would be out here with us? It didn't make sense. No one else should have been near us. This part of the bush was as isolated as it gets, with no other camps for miles. The voice crackled off, and for a moment, we were left in stunned silence. The excitement of hearing Santa on the radio made me forget all logic. I handed the walkie-talkie to Tom, and we both sprinted back to camp, eager to tell everyone. Our little feet slapped against the dirt as we ran, and the thick brush around us seemed to move with the wind, whispering in the distance. When we reached the campsite, I could see the other kids gathered around the fire pit, their faces lit by the glow of the flames. My parents and our friends' parents were sitting by the table, chatting with drinks in hand. As we burst into the clearing, they all turned, confused by our sudden return. "We heard Santa," I shouted, breathless. "On the walkie-talkie. He said he was looking for us to give us presents." The other kids looked at each other, their eyes wide. It was as if a switch had flipped, and suddenly, we were all talking at once, explaining what had just happened. Our excitement filled the air, making us all seem a little giddy. But as quickly as our enthusiasm bubbled up, it seemed to fall flat. My dad, who had been sitting at the fire, stood up, his face suddenly serious. "Let me see the walkie-talkie," he said. It wasn't a request, but a command. Tom handed it over, and I watched as my father's face changed. His brows furrowed, and he fiddled with the device, turning it over in his hands. I saw a strange look pass between the parents as they stood up, gathering closer. "Where did you find this?" my mother asked, her voice quiet, concerned. "We were just on the trail, not far from the creek," I said, suddenly feeling a tinge of uncertainty. The excitement I had felt was slowly morphing into a sense of unease. Why were the adults looking at each other like that? The walkie-talkie was taken from us, and our parents exchanged some hushed words that I couldn't understand. I could feel the energy shift. The warmth of the fire didn't seem to reach me anymore, and the shadows of the trees felt a little darker than they had earlier. That night, the atmosphere around the campsite was tense. The adults seemed on edge, occasionally glancing towards the trees, as if they were listening for something, though nothing unusual happened. The fire crackled and popped, but there was no laughter like there had been earlier. My parents kept a close eye on us, and we were told not to go anywhere for the rest of the trip. We were devastated. The idea of Santa coming to find us had been too magical to be real. We wanted to believe it, but the serious looks our parents exchanged made us hesitate. For the rest of the trip, we stayed close to the campsite, not venturing far into the bush. The walkie-talkies were taken away, and none of us were allowed to wander. The feeling of disappointment hung in the air, thick and heavy, but we couldn't ignore the strange sense of something being off. As the days passed, I began to feel it more and more. In hindsight, the situation was even more unsettling than I had realized at the time. The voice on the walkie-talkie had been too clear, too deliberate. It wasn't just a random interference or some sort of signal glitch. Whoever had spoken to us knew we were kids, knew how to gain our attention. and for a while I wondered if perhaps it had been some kind of test or even a prank. Looking back now as an adult, I realized the gravity of what had happened. What if that voice on the walkie-talkie hadn't been innocent? It wasn't just the fact that it sounded too confident, too familiar with our group of kids, but the timing. Whoever it was had been watching us. There was no other explanation for how they knew we were out there. That thought sent a chill down my spine as I reflected on it years later. We never found out who had been on the other end of the radio. I've always wondered if it was a person passing through the bush, maybe someone who had been following our group from a distance, or if it was someone with more sinister intent. There were no answers, just silence after that strange, inexplicable moment. The camp trip ended quietly, with everyone packing up and leaving the bush, never mentioning the walkie-talkie incident again. The memories faded over the years, but as I grew older, I started to understand why the adults had reacted the way they did. The bush is a vast and unpredictable place, and there's always a risk when strangers are involved. Now, all these years later, I can't shake the unsettling feeling that, while the adventure had been innocent enough for us kids, something darker was lurking around the edges of that experience. Something that wasn't there to bring presence at all. It was the middle of August, and the sun had already begun to set when I entered the boundary waters in northern Minnesota, my backpack weighing heavily on my shoulders. The air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and the faint tang of fresh water. I was alone, having decided on a solo hiking trip this time. No friends, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, BWCAW, is a place like no other, a vast, remote stretch of land filled with lakes, rivers, and dense forests. It's a place that demands respect, where the nearest town is miles away, and the closest sign of civilization might be a distant road that cuts through the trees, barely noticeable from where I was standing. The trail I was on was rough, winding its way through thick underbrush and over uneven rocks. My boots crunched on the forest floor as I moved steadily along, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant call of a loon, the wind rustling through the leaves, and the occasional splash of fish leaping from the water. It had been a full day of hiking, and I was starting to feel the fatigue in my legs. I had reached a small clearing near the edge of a lake, a perfect spot to set up camp for the night. I quickly got to work, setting up my tent and gathering firewood. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt a sense of peace and contentment as I sat by the fire, the crackling sound of the wood and the soft chirp of crickets filling the silence around me. But as the night deepened, something began to feel off. The air had grown unnervingly still, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, but it was too quiet, quieter than usual, even for a place like this. I brushed off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I had spent time out here before, and the Boundary Waters had a way of playing tricks on your mind. You're alone in the woods, far from anything familiar, and sometimes the silence can get to you. I threw another log onto the fire and settled back into my camping chair, the warmth of the flames spreading across my cold skin. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe some odd sound carried from a distant part of the forest. But no, it wasn't wind. It was music, faint at first, like a distant hum or a soft melody floating in from somewhere far off. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't any instrument I could recognize, but it didn't sound natural either. It was as though the forest itself had taken on a strange, unearthly tune. The music was faint but persistent, weaving through the trees and over the water. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. It had a rhythm almost like a song, but something about it felt wrong. The longer I listened, the more I began to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't place the source, but I knew it was coming from somewhere far off, beyond the tree line, out over the water, maybe even deeper into the forest. It was strange, like something out of a dream, but it didn't make me feel calm. The melody wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. I sat frozen for a moment, trying to figure out what it was. but no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make sense of it. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, swirling in the air and wrapping around me like an invisible thread. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam of light flicking across the camp as I scanned the surrounding forest. Nothing moved. No animals, no other hikers, no signs of life except for the fire crackling softly in front of me. The music continued, now a little louder, but still distant, too distant to make out any real details. I felt the unease creep deeper into my chest. I had read about odd happenings in the wilderness before. Strange sounds that had no explanation, the kind of things that made people question their sanity. But I had never experienced it myself. I had always thought those stories were either exaggerations or just the result of someone being too far out in the wild for too long. This was different. The music was real. It wasn't in my head. I could hear it and I couldn't explain it. The sound lasted for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was probably only a minute or so. It rose and fell in strange waves, almost as if it were breathing, taking on a rhythm that seemed to shift and change every time I thought I had figured it out. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. There was no fading out, no slow dying of the sound. It was just gone. I sat there, stunned, my flashlight still in hand, the beam now bouncing nervously over the camp. The fire crackled louder now, the silence that had followed the strange music almost unbearable in its intensity. My heart raced in my chest, and for the first time since I had arrived in the Boundary Waters, I felt truly alone, like something was watching me from just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, pacing around the camp, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I checked my map, as if there was something on it that could explain what had just happened. But the map was just a map. No answers there. I had no idea what the music was. It didn't make any sense. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't come from nature. It wasn't a bird call or the wind moving through the trees. It wasn't a loon or the howling of a distant wolf. It was something else. But there was nothing to be done about it. Couldn't go back now. The nearest town was hours away, and the nearest road was just a faint outline on the map. I had to sleep, or I wouldn't have the energy to continue my hike the next day. I stoked the fire again, adding a few more logs, and crawled into my tent, my nerves still on edge. The night passed in uneasy silence, with no further strange music. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. It was in the middle of 2013 when Chris and I set out for our hiking trip through a remote stretch of Western Australia's Pilbara region. We were both 23 at the time, still university students back in Perth, and it was the semester break, 2 full weeks without classes, no deadlines, and no pressure to be anywhere. We didn't have much money, but we had enough between us for fuel, food, and gear. And out there, money didn't matter. The plan was to drive north for about a day and a half, get as deep into the bush as we could without needing a support vehicle, then hike in from there. We had topo maps, satellite images printed out, a GPS device, and enough experience to know how far we could push it. Still, we both knew this wasn't a casual walk. This wasn't an area with ranger stations or well-used tracks. This was deep, hard, hot country. More red dirt and jagged rock than anything else, and not many people dared to come that far in on foot. We were after something different. Not just the peace and quiet, but the challenge. We were obsessed with pushing ourselves a bit farther each time, getting into places where it felt like nobody had walked in years. We'd leave the Hilux parked near an old mine access road and head out with all our gear loaded up. Water was our biggest weight, every liter counted. We packed light on everything else. Mostly dehydrated meals, instant coffee, a small burner, sleeping mats, and layered clothing that could handle both cold desert nights and brutal midday heat. The hike had gone to plan for the most part. On the 4th day in, we passed an old creek bed that had long dried up and came across a rock shelf shaped like a natural amphitheater. There were cliffs running along its side, and the shadows down in the cracks between boulders were deep enough that it was hard to tell where solid ground ended and void began. We were about 200 kilometers from the nearest outpost town and probably double that from anything with a full population. The air was still. the kind of silence that made your ears ring. The cliffs around us were about 30 to 40 meters high, sheer in some places and sloped in others, littered with loose stones and sharp bits of broken shale. We didn't see it at first. The plastic bag was mostly hidden by scrub, dull gray-green bushes that only came up to the knee, scattered like they'd been thrown there by the wind. It was Chris who spotted the edge of it. He thought it was garbage at first. So did I, and it didn't make sense to find trash that far out. There were no campsites nearby, no climbing routes listed on the maps or guidebooks, and the terrain was too harsh for casual tourists. When we got closer, we saw that it was a large plastic shopping bag, sun-bleached and stiff from age, but still sealed at the top with a knot. I remember how brittle it felt when I picked it up, like it had been out there for years. The weird part was how tight it had been tied. Not just rolled over and stuffed in a bush, but secured with care, like someone wanted to make sure nothing spilled. When we pulled it open, I thought maybe we'd find empty cans, maybe some torn up hiking gear, but instead we found wallets. 5 or 6 of them, all worn, some cracked open or half melted at the corners like they'd been out in the heat too long. There was no cash, just IDs, membership cards, student cards, and in some cases old receipts or bus tickets. All of them were female names, different birth dates, but all placing the women in their late teens or early 20s. None were local. 2 were from the Northern Territory. 1 was from Queensland. Another had an address in Sydney. The cards were all old, not vintage, but definitely not current. Some expired 3 or 4 years earlier. I remember holding one of them up, squinting at the date, and thinking it was odd how long they'd been out there. There was no obvious explanation. No sign of bags, no phones, no photos, no personal notes. Just wallets damaged, empty, and dumped. The edges of a couple had been chewed through by animals, and one still had fragments of a credit card melted into the fold. Warped by sun or fire, I couldn't tell. We looked around, tried to find any sign of other trash or objects, but that was it. Just that one bag, tucked into the brush like someone had gone to some effort to hide it without burying it. We talked it through, going over all the possible reasons for it being there. Maybe they were climbers, we said. People stash valuables before going up. Maybe they lost track of where they left it. Or maybe the bag got pulled out by an animal and moved downhill. But there were no signs of rope, chalk, climbing shoes, or gear. Nothing but that bag. Still, we didn't want to leave it behind. It didn't sit right with either of us. Not in a place like that. I packed the bag into the top of my frame pack and we hiked out the rest of the day in silence. I kept going back to the names in my mind. One of them had a student ID from a university I recognized in Brisbane. Another had a driver's license from Darwin. All different people, but all the same general age. Same gender. Same era. I kept wondering how 6 different wallets ended up together that far into the bush. We were another 3 days getting back to the Uda. By the time we returned to the mine road, both of us were sore, scratched up, and sunburnt. We'd run low on water that last day and spent the final few hours hiking in a kind of foggy autopilot. It wasn't until we were back on the sealed road, aircon on and the windows up, that either of us brought up the bag again. It felt like we'd been trying not to talk about it. We stopped at a roadhouse outside Port Headland to fuel up and get a bite to eat. Inside, we asked if there was a police station nearby. The guy behind the counter pointed us towards South Headland, about 20 minutes away. It was a small station, quiet, 2 officers working. We handed over the bag, explained where we'd found it and what was inside. The older officer, probably in his 50s, took it from us without saying much. But I'll never forget the way he looked at us. Quiet, blank at first, then something like concern creeping into his face. He didn't accuse us of anything, didn't ask too many questions. He just nodded and said he'd check into it. He kept one hand on the bag the whole time. We left our names and phone numbers, but we never heard anything back. A couple of months passed, then half a year, then a full year. We both brought it up a few times, wondering whether to follow up. Chris tried calling once, left a message but never got a reply, and eventually we stopped trying. Stayed with me though, not in a constant, overwhelming way, more like a splinter lodged deep in my memory. one that would sting whenever I saw something that reminded me of that trip. The dust, the cliffs, the hard white sun. Sometimes I'd see a girl on campus who looked like one of the license photos. Not exactly, but close enough to make my stomach knot. And the older I got, the more it bothered me. That someone, maybe multiple people, had probably gone missing. That their names had been printed on cards I'd held in my hands. And no one ever came asking. Years went by. I graduated, got a job, moved to a different city. Chris did the same. We drifted a bit, but still caught up every now and then. It wasn't until 2019 that I decided to look into it. It started as a late-night idea after a few beers, just searching names online. The ones I remembered. I only had two still clear in my mind, but one of them turned up a missing person report. A girl from Darwin who vanished during a trip south with friends in 2008. She was 19 at the time. Her friends last saw her leaving a campsite near Alice Springs. The trail had gone cold after that. No foul play was confirmed. No body found. I kept digging. Public records, archived news, missing persons lists. Another name matched a woman who had disappeared from Townsville in 2009. Another from Parramatta in 2010. All of them around the same age, all gone within a few years of each other. The details were sparse. A lot of these cases didn't get much attention, but there were patterns: solo travel, outback roads, small gaps between last sightings and when they were reported missing, all across the north. I never found anything official linking them together, but I knew what I saw. I knew what we found out there, and I still think about how someone had to put those wallets together. Someone gathered them, tied them up, and dumped them in the middle of nowhere. Somewhere so far out that only accident or obsession would lead someone to find them. Sometimes I wonder if we weren't supposed to see them. If we'd arrived a day earlier or later, maybe an animal would have scattered the contents and we would have walked past without noticing. Or if the plastic had degraded just a little more, they might have been lost forever. But we found them, and whoever left them there, whoever chose that spot, must have known how remote it was. I never went back to that part of the Pilbara. Neither did Chris. We still talk every now and then, and when we do, it always comes up eventually. He remembers the officer's face, the way he didn't say much but seemed to understand something we didn't. I've thought about pushing harder, contacting the families of the missing women, maybe even writing something publicly, but I keep stopping short. Maybe because there's nothing solid to prove, just a bag, a few names, a gut feeling. But if you've ever stood at the base of a cliff, in a place where the land stretches on forever without a single sound or sign of life, you'll know what I mean when I say some things. The sun was high in the sky, casting long, slanting shadows through the trees as I made my way down the old trail that led to the river. The land was mine, passed down from my grandfather to my father and, eventually, to me. It wasn't much, just a few hundred acres tucked away in the woods of northern Wisconsin. But it was enough to keep me busy, enough to keep me grounded. I had been walking for hours, taking in the peaceful solitude, my boots crunching over the fallen leaves and twigs that littered the path. My mind wandered, thinking about the upcoming season and the feed plots I needed to prepare for next year's hunting season. It was a lot of work, but I loved it. The quiet of the woods, the feeling of being alone with nature. It was something I couldn't find anywhere else. As I reached the edge of the river, I slowed my pace, my eyes scanning the surroundings. The area was dense with trees, their thick trunks rising high above me, the underbrush thick with ferns and low-growing shrubs. I had walked this path 100 times before, but today something felt off. It was just a sensation, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that something wasn't quite right. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired. That was when I saw it, the tent. It wasn't far off the trail, tucked between two large pines, partially obscured by the brush. It stood out like a sore thumb in the otherwise untouched landscape, a bright blue canvas that seemed out of place among the brown and green of the forest. I stopped, my heart rate picking up slightly. There shouldn't be anyone out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one camped on my land without permission. My hand instinctively reached for the knife at my belt, just a precaution, but I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger. Not yet. I stood there for a moment watching the tent. It looked abandoned at first glance. No smoke rising from a fire pit, no movement around the campsite. But then I saw her. A woman stepped out from behind the tent. She was wearing a loose, faded dress that hung awkwardly on her thin frame, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She didn't seem to notice me at first, her back to me as she stood there, staring at the river. For a moment, I thought I might turn around and leave. There was something off about her, something strange in the way she moved. But I didn't. I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes following her every movement. She turned toward me, and for the first time, I saw her face. Her features were sharp, her eyes wide and unblinking. She had a wild look about her, like someone who had been living outside the bounds of civilization for too long. I wasn't sure what it was about her. Maybe the way she stood there, staring at me unafraid, but something in my gut told me I was dealing with a person who wasn't all there. She started walking toward me, her feet bare and soft against the forest floor. I didn't move, but my hand tightened around the knife. Something about her felt wrong, like I should be wary, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She kept walking closer and closer until she was only a few feet away. I didn't speak, didn't make a sound. I just stood there watching her approach. Then, to my utter disbelief, she squatted down in front of me, completely unfazed. Without any sign of discomfort, she dropped her pants and began to relieve herself right there in the woods. My mind raced. What the hell was happening? My body went rigid. I had no idea how to respond. I wanted to turn and walk away, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away either. I didn't know if it was the shock of the situation or the sheer oddness of it all, but I felt frozen in place. Without thinking, my hand slipped into my pocket, and I pulled out the handkerchief I always carried with me. I had no intention of helping her, God no, but there was something in the way she acted, something that told me she wasn't fully aware of what was going on. Maybe she was just lost. Maybe she needed help. Maybe I could at least offer her some decency. I held the handkerchief through the gap in the branches, hoping it would catch her attention. She glanced down at it, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Without a word, she stood up, her pants still around her ankles, and bolted, running as fast as she could. She stumbled on a rock, tripped, and fell forward, but she didn't stop. She got up, brushed herself off, and ran harder, disappearing into the trees without a trace. I stood there, staring after her, my mind racing. What had just happened? My chest tightened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. That whole encounter was wrong. The way she had acted, the way she ran without a second thought, it didn't make sense. Who was she? Why was she out here in the middle of nowhere? I knew my land well. I knew the history of the area, the families that had lived here before me. But I didn't recognize her, and I certainly didn't recognize her behavior. I turned back to the river, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my chest. As I started to walk back toward the trail, I couldn't help but glance at the spot where the tent had been. It was gone, just like that, vanished. There was no sign of it, no trace of the woman who had been there only minutes before. My heart began to pound in my chest again, but this time, I didn't feel like I was in danger. I felt confused and a little scared. I didn't return to the property right away. I spent the next few hours walking the trails, checking the boundaries, and making sure everything was secure. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the task at hand, I couldn't shake the thought of the woman. Who was she? What was she doing on my land? And why hadn't she said a word? Later that evening, I sat down with my father over a cup of coffee, the old man staring out the window as the sun set behind the trees. I told him about the woman, about the tent and the strange encounter. He listened quietly, his face unreadable. "You know, son," he said after a long silence, "there's something about this land that people don't understand. A long time ago, there was a hippie colony over in the northwest corner. It was back in the 80s before you were born. A bunch of people who thought they could live off the land, away from the world. They left when things started to fall apart, but some of their kids still come around from time to time. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. What do you mean, they're kids? Like, they still live out here. They come and go, he said. They're not like us. They don't understand the way we do things. Some of them never left, and now they're raising their own families out here. But they don't always respect the boundaries, son. And they don't always follow the same rules we do. A chill ran through me. Suddenly, the woman, the tent, the way she acted, it all made sense. I realized I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. These were people who had chosen to live outside of society, people who didn't follow the same norms as everyone else. And I had unknowingly walked right into their world. The next day, I walked the same path again, hoping to find something that could explain what had happened. But the land was quiet. The tent was gone. The only sign of the woman was a single, small footprint in the mud near the riverbank. It was the only clue I had, but it didn't feel like enough to make any real sense of the situation. I never saw her again, and as the weeks passed, the strange feeling in my gut never really went away. I found myself more cautious on the trails, more aware of my surroundings. It was as if the encounter had opened a door into a world I wasn't meant to see, a world hidden just out of view, tucked away in the corners of the forest. But I kept it to myself. I didn't tell anyone else about the encounter, not even my uncle. It was my land, my responsibility, and whatever had happened, I knew I had to be ready for anything. But something told me that no matter how much I prepared, there was no getting rid of the feeling that I was being watched. And that feeling stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind, long after the woman and her tent had disappeared into the woods. It was the summer of 2016, and I had taken a break from my job as a mechanic in southern Idaho. I'd saved up enough vacation time to spend a couple of weeks out in the wilderness. I'd been slowly getting into solo camping and hiking, mostly to reset my mind and get away from the usual routine. After years of working long hours in a garage, being alone out in nature had started to feel like something I needed every now and then, like food or water. That August, I decided to head out to the northern part of Montana, near the edge of Glacier National Park. It's a beautiful area, huge stretches of wilderness, lots of hiking trails, and the kind of quiet that sinks deep into your bones. I drove my old gray Dodge Caravan, the back of it set up with a mattress, small drawers for gear, a cooler, and a few tools. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. I didn't follow a rigid plan. I moved from one small campground to another, sometimes sleeping in the van, sometimes in a tent. I wasn't going deep into the backcountry, just hitting the quieter campgrounds near trails, nothing too remote. I kept my phone off most of the time, just using a paper map and notes I scribbled down at gas stations and visitor centers. I had no real deadlines, no real route. Just me, a few gallons of drinking water, instant oatmeal, trail mix, and some cans of stew. About 8 days in, I stayed at a little campground tucked near a stream west of Polebridge. It wasn't one of the more developed spots. There were only about 10 sites, a pit toilet, and a bear-proof trash container. I pulled in around 3 in the afternoon, chose a site near the far end, and spent the rest of the evening eating dinner at the picnic table and reading a paperback I had already gone through twice. There was a tent a few spots over, and I saw a fire going there, but I didn't think much of it. A couple of other vehicles had come in too. A white SUV, an old Subaru with a canoe strapped to the top, and what looked like a rental truck with out-of-state plates. People mostly kept to themselves. I slept in the van that night. I usually did when I felt even a little off, and for some reason, that night I just didn't want to set up the tent. It had been quiet, and the weather was perfect, cool and still, no wind, no rain. I remember waking up sometime after midnight needing to pee. I debated it for a while, trying to hold it, but eventually I opened the sliding door slowly and stepped out into the dark with my headlamp. The air was cold and the forest smelled like pine and smoke. I walked a little way from the van and relieved myself behind a tree. I was just about to climb back in when I heard the sound of footsteps. Fast, crunching, panicked. At first I thought it might be a deer or someone running, But within seconds, I saw a flashlight beam swinging wildly between trees, cutting through the darkness. Then a voice yelled loud and sharp. It wasn't yelling at me specifically, but it was close. I heard the words, "Get in your car now," and it was repeated again, then again. A figure appeared between the trees, wearing a reflective vest and a wide-brimmed hat. My heart jumped before I processed that it was a ranger. He waved his arm at me and shouted something again, and even without understanding every word, I got the message. I slammed the sliding door shut and got into the driver's seat, locking the doors as I did. From the driver's side window, I watched as the ranger moved through the sights, yelling, gesturing, shining his light in tents and vehicles. A few car engines started. I saw the woman in the white SUV start pulling away. Then a man from the rental truck, barefoot and wearing a t-shirt and boxers, staggered to his van and climbed in. The next 20 minutes felt like something out of a dream, slow and unreal. The ranger moved through quickly, checking each site, and when he got back near mine, I rolled my window down an inch. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. He told me to stay in the van and keep the doors locked. I nodded and rolled the window back up. I waited in silence, heart pounding in my chest. The campground was dark except for the ranger's light and the distant headlights from people who had already left. Then, through the stillness, I heard something strange, like a dragging sound, maybe a snorting or low growling. It was hard to tell. I was frozen in place, trying not to move or breathe loudly. About 15 minutes later, another ranger vehicle came in. Then another. The campground started to light up with flashlights and headlights. But nobody was getting out of their vehicles, not even the rangers. Eventually, 2 of them stepped out, armed with rifles. They moved slowly, their bodies tense, scanning the edge of the woods near the far end of the campground, toward the spot where the tent had been earlier. I realized I couldn't see that tent anymore. The next hour went by with more rangers arriving, some talking over radios, some standing guard. Around 3:45 a.m., they came to each car and spoke to us through slightly cracked windows. The ranger who came to mine looked shaken, his face pale even in the dark. He told me that a grizzly bear had killed a woman in her tent one site over and that the bear had not yet been located. He said they believed the animal had moved off, but they couldn't be sure. He advised that I leave the campground immediately and head south to a more developed area. They were shutting the whole site down. I was so stunned I didn't ask any questions. I turned the key and slowly drove down the dirt road, heart still hammering. I didn't know the woman, had never even seen her up close, but I couldn't stop picturing her tent. It had looked so normal when I went to bed. Just another camper. Now it was gone, and she was gone too. I ended up pulling into a highway turnout about 20 miles south and sleeping with the engine off and the windows up until sunrise. I didn't fall asleep for a long time. I stuck to more developed campgrounds after that. I didn't stop hiking or camping, but something shifted in me after that night. I became more alert, more sensitive to every sound. I carried bear spray everywhere, even when just going to the bathroom. I read every single warning sign twice. For days later, I was heading back west, slowly making my way toward Idaho. I had camped at a large campground near Libby and hit the road just after 6:30 a.m. I had only driven about 15 minutes when I saw flashing lights in my mirror. A county sheriff's car pulled up behind me fast. Then another came around the bend in front, blocking the road. I stopped the van, confused and fully awake now. Before I could think, a deputy was at my door, shouting something I couldn't hear. He yanked the door open and grabbed me by the arm, pulling me out and throwing me face down on the gravel. My arm twisted under me, and I yelled in pain as another set of hands held me down and cuffed me. I kept trying to speak, but they were shouting too, and everything happened so fast I could barely keep track. A third officer yanked open the van's side door. I heard him shout, "Clear!" A few seconds later, and then more rustling and footsteps. Finally, someone pulled me up to sit, then uncuffed me. My wrists were red and throbbing. The deputy who had first pulled me out crouched in front of me, out of breath, and told me what they thought had happened. Apparently, someone had murdered 4 people in the campground I had just left, 2 adults and 2 kids. It had happened overnight, probably just a few hours before I left. The police believed the suspect had hijacked a van to escape, threatening the driver with a machete. My van matched the description. I matched the general age and look. They thought I was a hostage. When I didn't stop fast enough, probably because I hadn't seen the cruiser in front yet, they assumed I was being forced to keep going. The whole thing had spiraled from there. They searched the van again, this time more slowly, and eventually cleared me to leave. They even apologized, kind of, but the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. That day, I drove all the way back to Idaho without stopping. No food, no gas, no photos. Just white knuckles on the steering wheel and my eyes on the road. I didn't sleep in that van again for months. Even after the police cleared me, even after they found the real guy a day later hiding in an abandoned cabin, I couldn't shake the image of what they thought they saw, that I was a man being forced at knife point to drive away from a murder scene. And worse, the idea that I had unknowingly slept that close to it, unaware, just like I had been near the bear attack. Both times I had been right there, one site over, a few hours ahead, maybe 100 feet away, close enough to feel it in my bones later, close enough that it stuck with me. I kept camping after that, kept hiking too, but the way I looked at the woods changed. I still loved the trees and the silence and the way wind moved through tall grass, but I started noticing other things more. The way a tent zipper sounds when it opens at night, the snap of a twig behind a tree, the shape of tire tracks in gravel. I haven't been back to that area in Montana since. I don't know if I ever will.